Hello, this is John Spink, Director of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University and an Assistant Professor in the College of Veterinary Medicine. And this is my presentation for the Food Forum meeting at the National Academies of Sciences on December 4th, 2018 here in Washington, D.C. And the title is Technology Related to Detection, Traceability, and/or Adulteration, generally focused on food fraud. Thank you for the opportunity to present. First off, real brief background on Michigan State. So we are a university, we teach, that's what we do, and you'll see the cycle on the right, research, education, and outreach. Definitely we do work in that cycle. Here is my presentation is outreach, talking to you. I've learned a lot already along the way and have cycled back into the research, gone back to either ongoing projects or previous publications, scholarly reports, and reviewed things in a little more detail. And that then feeds into education, which we also are ongoing teaching. So first off, the base of our curriculum are MOOCs, Massive Open Online Courses. These are, the content's free, there's a certificate of completion, and this is a real way that we communicate out these new topics. They're basically two-hour webinars, and we've got 4 of them, and they're growing. And these are based on a wide range of needs, including industry needs for industry-type certifications or meeting government regulations. Next, executive education. We conduct these on-site at Michigan State around the world. They're more focused usually. We have graduate courses. We are an online graduate program. They're real Michigan State graduate courses. They just happen to be online. And regarding food fraud, we have 6 courses that cover food fraud in one way or another. If you're taking those courses, they really focus on education, not so much on training, meaning the core concepts, the basics, really a broad foundation to make good decisions. And if you take 4 of those courses, they could lead into a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention, just a way to demonstrate to your organization or agency or company that you've got a deeper formal understanding of this, and then those credits can roll right into a Master's of Science online. This is a real Michigan State Master's course, and this includes other options like a international food law course. Some group I'd like to thank is we have a food fraud think tank. So these are members of industry that provide gifts for us to conduct our ongoing operations. Mars, Dannon, Cargill, Wegmans, Mondelez, Hershey's, Woolworths, and growing. Really the key that they do is they support our Food Fraud Initiative mission of standardized and prevention practices. We focus on policy and strategy only. We don't do testing. We don't gather information. For them, it demonstrates internal or external leadership, and some of the deliverables that have been enabled by them is our expanded engagement internationally, such as at Codex and ISO, places that don't have travel funding. If we don't have funding, we can't be there. If we're not there, we can't hear what's going on or contribute to the discussions. Also, the MOOCs expanded from the basic MOOC to the other detailed MOOCs specifically out of needs that they had for themselves, their suppliers, or their customers, and a wide range of activities, including outreach, such as this video being pre-recorded and put on YouTube. So the scope for today is a couple points. Really looking over technology related to detection, traceability, and adulteration. So that's the key broad focus and the key question. Now, to address that question, we could say what type of technology actually is needed, but you have to dig in to understand beyond what's available to what's needed and why you're working on it. So we'll dig into food fraud on that. But first off, looking at detection, this is really our definition, the scope of industry is looking at contaminants and adulterants. Contaminants is defined by Codex, adulterants is not, which is interesting to continue to use a term that's not really formally defined. So we're trying to detect something in the product or some type of deviation or variation. For us, this would really be defined as food quality, food safety, or food defense. And I'll get into those details later, definitions. Traceability is a separate concept. It's where the product's been, where it's going, and where it is now. And what we're looking here at is transparency, control, and recall. So traceability in and of itself is not magic. It doesn't solve problems. It helps us identify problems, and that's a real key to understand that this is a tool that's used, not the end machine itself. And adulteration. So there's been a wide range of definitions of adulteration, U.S. through the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act and others, but really overall adulteration is generally used as this food fraud concept. So we'll get into that in a moment as well. But the real focus is, the goal is not to catch product, but to prevent health hazards. And I think a lot of times we get stuck in this idea of our response or reaction, or maybe the role of science and technology, which is a reaction response after an incident, not the preventative approach. And we'll look around at that to look at the interdisciplinary aspect of that. First off, global trends. So industry requirement has a GFS requirement under the Global Food Safety Initiative for all companies, essentially, as of January 2018. It's not optional, and they do this concept of VASIP, Vulnerability Assessment and Control Point Plan. Includes a vulnerability assessment and a prevention strategy. These are required. Now, key is there's not much detail is needed yet, but they are required. So industry is moving this direction. You might not be aware in your company that there is a lot of activity, but you do have a food safety management system, and you must be certified against it if you want to sell product to pretty much anybody. So there is activity. A key is starting to refine that activity, and I think that's a role of our group here. What's happening is harmonized and sharing of best practices. This is a real key things moving forward, is that now meet with 3 companies in 3 days. They're all starting down the same path, and that's a real key. They're starting in that direction. I think a real challenge will be for agencies to also leverage that, and that's part of my presentation today, to explain that. The foundation is really to an interdisciplinary approach, and this interdisciplinary approach that's required. Criminology is a start, and there's not too many food scientists or food safety people that have criminology backgrounds or apply it in the job. And we really, to look at the root cause, it's completely logical to look at the root cause first. That's criminology. Then another set of questions is how much is enough? Yes, every incident is bad, but how bad? And that is it. If you heard of it, would you leave the room right now and go call your CEO or your boss, or would you deal with it, or would you wait till the end of the day? Would you wait till tomorrow? How much is enough for your response? And one thing that's fortunate is managerial accounting has that in enterprise risk management. This was meeting the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and so it's something that we can adopt. I won't say adapt, I will say adopt, because it's already in place. For public policy, it's a different issue, and so we need to go to the field of public policy to look at that, how much is enough, because there's not an ultimate financial balance sheet for each senator, but there's other issues there. And then finally, food science and authenticity is detection. So when we get to the overall question of this presentation, the first question is, we know that bit about detection for technology is we need to define and scope the problem, and we need to define and scope what's needed. If something's needed to detect at 1%, then we don't need a test that detects parts per million, and that's a real key. Also, we need to look at this focus on prevention and how it contributes to prevention. So, focused on the root cause by first considering the problem. So for food fraud incidents, what we've got, just thinking about a history of what's happened and what are they. High-profile incidents that really shifted the industry was in 2004. Sudan red was a carcinogen colorant. It's used to make spices bright and attractive. That kind of came and went, and it continues to go. Melamine was big. That was around 2007. Infant formula around the world, pet food in the U.S. This really got the attention of industry. This is what sparked the Global Food Safety Initiative to really start looking at it and considering it. And then in the midst of the GFSI activity was horse meat and beef. And this really rocked the industry, because if that was in there at such a high level and so far around the world, this wasn't just one little incident that got into one place. It was a huge worldwide concern. But really, more importantly, it identified vulnerabilities. That if you weren't testing for other species, then that type of fraud could occur. So those are the main incidents that really affected consumers, affected governments and industry. And really, one thing we see is in the future, there's an ongoing stream of incidents that are identified or reclassified as food fraud. Now that food fraud has become a thing, now that we've named it and scoped it, we can go back and we can put things in a category. And it's no longer some kind of unknown food quality issue or food safety, it's food fraud. And that's really increased the focus on the work. Also, there's been a wide range of other incidents. 2005 was expiration code refreshing of infant formula, so that would be expired product in the market. 2010 along the way as well, species swapping of fish, substitution. 2011, a truckload of raw poultry stolen and reintroduced into commerce. So that's been mishandled possibly, and it's raw, so that's got other concerns. Pre-deal larceny, this is in the Caribbean. Goats stolen in exchange for guns. So the exchange for guns is getting into national security, but when you're looking at these basically farmers having their goats stolen, so that is a form of food fraud. 2014, stolen crab thawed and sold as fresh Chesapeake Bay crab. Now, I just saw a crab cake last night on the menu for about $30, so this is definitely something that's a high value and very, very important issue in this area. Miscellaneous, conventional product labeled as organic, GM labeled as conventional, and these are kind of things that keep coming up. So what is food fraud? If we're looking at that as the base of those incidents, and illegal deception for economic gain using food. And this is consistent with the GFSI, the EU, ISO, and others. It includes a subcategory of economically motivated adulteration. So this is what might be more well known in the U.S. because FDA has used that term, but really EMA is just adulterant substance. That's been the focus there, and that's the subcategory of food fraud. The FDA has a working definition of EMA as a substance for economic gain. Although FDA and the food laws cover all types of hazards, EMA specifically is just a substance. The motivation is economic gain. That's a real key, and that's how it differentiates from other problems such as food defense, where the motivation is traditionally harm or terror. And then kind of within that, the FSMA intentional adulteration rule is narrowed to wide-scale human health harm. So things like disgruntled employees or tampering, things like that would not be under the IA rule, but those are under all food defense. For food fraud, there's always an economic threat. There's not always a public health threat. There is always a vulnerability. So when there's this threat, that's where there's a lot more of the government regulatory enforcement type focus. But when you're looking at the overall economy of a country, or you're looking at a company itself, is this vulnerability is really important to look at, because you can address vulnerabilities when you define them. There's a wide range of issues. I also mentioned them in an earlier slide. So what is food fraud? There's a wide range. This is defined by GFSI, and here are the types of fraud: dilution, substitution, contaminant, gray market theft, diversion, mislabeling, unimproved enhancements, and counterfeiting. Now, that's a broad range of topics, and if you're a supplier quality assurance or you're contaminant testing early warning system for a company, you don't cover a lot of these. But a key is that your company is harmed, and consumers are harmed by any of these. In any situation, things could go wrong. Look at theft, the poultry problem. There's also overruns and tampering, which are a sub-function of some of these. The main focus by FDA and really regulatory agencies is on the public health threats. And that's why early on FDA had a focus there on economically motivated adulteration. But even focusing on the U.S. and FDA, it's critical to step back and understand that all types of fraud are illegal. And I say FDCA and FSMA, that's the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and the Food Safety Modernization Act's Preventive Controls Rule. All of these hazards must be assessed and documented regardless of the outcome. So, how is food fraud different than anything else? So really what we wanted to do is we wanted to focus on the motivation. So we need to look at the root cause. And the root cause for different types of food risks is very different. Food safety and food defense, we know this. So it's inherently in the product, or it's a bad guy trying to harm us. That was the traditional focus of agencies and companies. When we started to look at food fraud and preventing it, we realized that addressing food fraud was fundamentally different than addressing the other food risks. Now, to really complete the concept, food quality is included in here as well. That's just a part of the overall food risk matrix. It is a risk. Also, the controls in general are quality control or quality management type concepts, plan, do, check, act, things like that. So food quality is in there. Also, many times in industry, these functions are under a food quality or quality assurance group. The column on the left is unintentional. You do not try to create these problems. The columns on the right, the bad guys know what they're doing. They're intentionally acting. For food defense, the motivation is public health, economic, or terror harm. They're trying to harm someone else. Now, for food fraud, the motivation is economic gain. And if someone's very good at this and they get product into a legitimate retailer, they're going to work very hard to make sure you're a satisfied customer. Even though it's fraudulent product, they're going to try to make sure of that. So this is a way to look at and define the differences between the different types of food risks. Now, within it, terrorism is under food defense. Now, a real key is that terrorism is very narrowly defined by the UN, FBI, and others. So that's a very small subcategory, very important, but sub. The intentional adulteration rule in the U.S. covers wide-scale harms. This is a lot more than just terrorism, but it's not all food defense, and that's really important to point out. For food fraud, economically motivated adulteration is a subset. It's only a small part of food fraud, but it is an important part. So prevention is criminology. And we're not running around trying to catch bad guys. We're trying to prevent them from committing their act, and that is situational crime prevention. Exactly, specifically, completely situational crime prevention. Focuses on the motivation, look at factors that lead to system weaknesses, and there's this kind of continuum of detect, deter, prevent. We're trying to move the concepts, whether it's a company or a country or an industry, along that continuum into the real prevent mode. And what we've got is this crime triangle, the fraud opportunity. And it's defined by the victim, the fraudster, and these guardian and hurdle gaps. So one thing that's great here is we've got a academic theory that's very well thought out, that's researched continually since the 70s and really applied. There's so many examples of applying this in the real world, and we can apply it to food fraud. So we're really adapting this to our needs. So that's the real focus. And now with this, we can start to look at that guardian hurdle gaps to say, what's the needs of science and technology to reduce the fraud opportunity? Now we have a real specific specification and definition. The science and sciences of food fraud prevention. So consider the disciplines that apply. So this honeycomb view here is a lot of the sciences that we deal with on a regular basis. I think at the bottom you'll see food authenticity and food safety. That's where people really start and what they think. And then it gets into criminology of we're going to go arrest them, we're going to go find them. And I'll say if you want to go chase bad guys around the world, please let me refer you to a law firm because I would love to have the commission on that. Could retire on that. But so it's not just criminology of finding them; it's looking and studying them through things like intelligence analysis and looking at that piece. Now, I'll get back to journalism later, but farther up is social science of these standards and certification. So there's a common practice. Public policy is important in governments. And at the top is business, which is enterprise risk management. This is key to look at how much is enough. And that also includes supply chain management, so looking at product moving through the supply chain, monitoring it, and decision sciences, how we make decisions as well. Journalism's in there, and might seem like an odd one, but one thing we see is that journalists are great investigators in the marketplace, but also they report on food fraud that they find. But a lot of times they don't. What they find is not actually food fraud. It could be suspicious only. And so what we've done is we realized that there needed to be more information shared there. So we got with our journalism department, and we have an article under review on methods for suspicious activity reporting. And by having our journalism colleagues, it covers journalism in the article, but also we're going to reach out to the journalism associations and groups to share information on training, things like a MOOC maybe for journalists. And so in that case, then hopefully we're getting those type of methods out, so there'll be just better and stronger reporting and support their role in this as well. So as you'll see, there's a lot of disciplines involved to really get to the point of understanding the problem, understanding how much is enough, and actually acting. And actually before we even start to do detection. Laws, regulations, standards, and certifications. So for food fraud compliance, the Global Food Safety Initiative, which is a number of other food safety management systems, they require addressing food fraud as of 2018, and the GFSI members represent approximately 65% of the world trade. That would be the bigger companies, international companies, and then they implement it across their supply chains. Required is a food fraud vulnerability assessment for all products, prevention strategy for all products. No documents equal no audit nonconformance. So that's a real key. And no certification, no sales, or at least a lot of explaining. So if you're a food company, you require your suppliers to have a food safety management system. If they just failed it, then there's a lot of problems. You have problems with that. There'll be a lot to look at. And that's a real key. This is a real driver that's changing industry, changing paradigms. Food Safety Modernization Act, the preventive controls, this was covered back in 2016. It essentially did address all types of hazards, regardless of the outcome, and they do mention intentional acts for economic gain. And if you don't believe me, there's a quote from the CFR: hazard analysis must be written regardless of its outcome. So you have to have a hazard analysis. You can't just say we're not worried about stolen goods or food fraud. That's great, but you have to have an analysis to explain that. And specifically, there's a section in there that says the hazard may be intentionally introduced for the purposes of economic gain. So food fraud is absolutely positively covered under FSMA, whether you know it or like it or not. Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. Now, really, Dr. Ostroff from FDA kept emphasizing that food fraud's been illegal at least since 1938 in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act because they have adulterated food section and misbranded food section. Just it hasn't been a major focus or haven't had awareness because it's not been defined as a thing. Sarbanes-Oxley Act. So this is the financial reporting. It's 2002. All risks to revenue are disclosed or confirmed to be managed. And so this is clearly all those incidents I mentioned definitely could impact revenue. International standards. So ISO is working in this area. ISO 22000 is a foundation for GFSI. Technical Committee 292 on security management has a wide range of standards, and actually two new ones I didn't mention here that deal directly with product fraud, and food is identified as a product in there. Codex. There's a discussion paper on food fraud. I'm a scientific advisor to that group, and also work through the U.S. Codex delegation. So that's moving forward. InfoSan. It was one of 4 topics at the annual meeting in 2016, and there's a current publication under review and sharing of the role of InfoSan in food fraud prevention. So it's definitely got some traction. Related NGO associations, one is USP, who's here. ILSI, OAC, and others have a lot. There's a lot of activity. It seems like everybody's defining the term and concept, and so things are moving forward. Prevention strategy, research, development. So the conclusion I really look at here is it's really been there's been an inefficient single discipline response to current public health harm, and when there's no harm, there's no focus. So melamine comes up and then it goes away. It's not a focus. So that's been a real inefficiency. Prevention is interdisciplinary. It's not complex, but difficult to shift the paradigm. I think that's another opportunity here to look at the big picture, because the base concepts are very simple. The criminology concepts are literally taught in Criminology 101, but they'd be novel for someone that's never understood them before. There's a need to further develop an interdisciplinary prevention, vulnerability reduction focus. So it's kind of putting these things together. There's also a challenge of agency metrics that focus on response, not prevention. And so along the way to measure success, a lot of times you keep doing what you're doing. That might be arresting more bad people or seizing more product instead of looking at some of those preventive controls. So what I would end with my for this group, the challenge and opportunity is to lead a paradigm shift, and it's really good timing for this. There's a lot of activity going on. There's a lot of need for direction, whether it's agencies or universities in the U.S. And the questions I have are: what's the root cause of the problem, and enabling an efficient prevention approach, including success metrics? So to shift that focus to really quality management, even for agencies, law enforcement, or regulatory. What is the proper addressing of vulnerabilities, weaknesses in the system versus hazard, which are problems that will lead to harm if not immediately addressed? So what's the proper addressing of vulnerabilities versus hazard? What's the efficient food traceability to improve food safety and consumer confidence? Traceability is a big issue. There's a lot of noise in the marketplace, a lot of activity, a lot of excitement, and really there's an opportunity to tap that and guide it and direct it and explain what's really needed, define the specification. Really, my summary overall is: what's the optimal role of the U.S. government and regulatory role in food fraud prevention? And even to define what is prevention, So I think this is the overall focus that I would bring to the group. The opportunity to start with a framing report or white paper, and then identify what's next. A lot of ways you can engage with us. Please feel free to contact me if you have any more questions, concerns, information, needs. A lot of people to thank, and I'm really pleased to have been invited here, and it's through some of my other colleagues that I was identified as a speaker, so thank you to all of them, and with that, I'll take discussion.